And we are live, and we have just learned you can't buy socks in Canada right now.
Quebec is heading into a 30-day lockdown with a curfew as of tomorrow for 30 days. I might go on a curfew from Twitter for those 30 days and document it and see if I feel spiritually cleaner after that. But yeah, can't buy socks. It's not an essential item. And I was at the pharmacy that turned away an old, disheveled man who maybe was homeless, who lifted up his pants to show that he wasn't wearing socks. And the cashier refused to sell him the socks because they're not essential items. And I bought bubblegum and Kinder Bueno something just to prove a point.
Well, so perfect. That's starting out with the ridiculous. So we'll go into even more ridiculous. Today is all about Section 230, what's going on with social media, the internet, etc. And to do this, wow, I brought on so many more qualified people than myself. It's just amazing. Starting with Ian, please introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Ian Corzine. I'm referred to in social media as your social media lawyer. I'm a fierce advocate for freedom of speech online. And so a lot of my content, whether it be on Instagram or YouTube or Facebook, has to do with how we can allow people to freely express themselves online, because I believe it's the foremost way we're going to be able to get our free speech out there in the future, because we can't go outside. Buy socks.
And no socks for you.
Yeah.
Nick.
Hi. I'm Nick Rekieta of Rekieta Law, a small law firm in central Minnesota. And I am also a massive free speech advocate and have been watching the social media crackdown occur over a long period of time. Although since the events of January 6th, we've seen things accelerate beyond what I was thinking. With some high profile removals from social media. And so, and not to mention traditional media as well. So maybe we'll get to discuss that along with 230 in sort of the melding of medias that's going on.
I have a feeling there might be a chat comment or two about that. I don't know. I could be wrong, but something tells me it may cross. Allison.
I'm Alison Morrow. I started out my TV news career as a producer at Fox News Channel for their morning show many years ago. And I then went to graduate school to study theology, thinking I was going to be a psychologist. Then I got back into news, and I spent the last 12 years as a reporter, finished up in Seattle, transitioned to YouTube, and have started talking about this issue mostly because nobody in my old industry really is. And I don't quite understand that. Perhaps it's because they don't feel like they're going to be affected by lockdowns of information on the internet, because they still have their, their news stations, or maybe they feel like they're, they have relationships enough, I guess, with the big tech companies that they're not going to be affected. Not totally sure, but it's going to affect me, obviously, because I don't have the NBC logo behind me anymore. So there's a personal side to it. Obviously, I want to keep my YouTube channel going. I'm,
Sure.
a smaller YouTuber. And then there's also just sort of the larger aspect of, as somebody who was in journalism and hopes to continue helping that profession kind of redeem itself in the public's eyes. I feel like the internet is the place we're going to be able to start doing that. So it's an important topic for me.
For sure. And last but not least, Viva.
David. And just this started way back in the day, and it spawned the chicanery shirt, because I've been making YouTube videos for 5 or 6 years, but only started dealing with law stuff in the last 2 years, dedicated law stuff in the last 2.5 years. Yep. And I started noticing, as I just do some legal breakdowns, explanations, and I started noticing that some of the videos were starting to get demonetized. Things were going on with the channel. Videos would get retroactively demonetized. And it spawned a playlist called YouTube Chicanery, and I turned it into a merch shirt. But I never thought, you always think it won't be a problem for me if you remain respectful, you don't swear, you don't cross certain lines that the instigators cross. But then you realize it's just inch by inch. It chisels away at the most extreme, in quotes, to the most instigative, if that's a word, types. And then it just, then it's ideological. And at a certain point, I notice which videos get demonetized and which don't. And it's an amazing thing. And sooner than later, the YouTube and internet is going to be a wasteland for what television has become if things don't get better.
Okay. Well, to start things off, I'd say that Ian probably is the most on point in terms of intellectual law. I'm not sure. slap me down and correct me. But
Nick is for sure.
Oh, Nick. Oh, well, Nick's just a scholar. The scholar amongst us.
I defer to Ian. I defer.
I understand that Section 230 came out of essentially the Prodigy lawsuit back in the 90s.
1996, yes. Mm-hmm.
And could you go into a little bit, like the baseline history, like a sketch note, and what it ultimately is?
Well, what I would prefer to do is to actually do a kind of a quick little background that would be a little bit more maybe inclusive for people who are watching. The bottom line is, in my opinion, Section 230 gave social media platforms some protection, some ability to control the content on their platform. Back then, it really wasn't understood about how large an impact social media could have on the public. And so as a result, they wanted to encourage more social media to grow. They wanted people's voices to be heard, but they also wanted, as private sector businesses, to allow the social media platforms to control what was being produced on their platforms. So really what has happened over time is we've gotten into a discussion about how we further limit the impact of Section 230, which provides a broad liability protection for the social media platforms, how we constrain it. And I think that the thrust of my arguments is maybe we don't constrain it. Maybe if Mark Zuckerberg is saying we need more regulation over social media, over what's said on social media, maybe we should do the opposite. Maybe we should allow more and more content to be on the platforms. And I include harassment. I include hate speech, so that people have a better choice and can determine what they want. I was thinking into myself this morning, I was like, Nick probably doesn't get his news primarily from the New York Times. And the reason why he probably doesn't is he probably doesn't trust the New York Times. And so he prefers not to spend money on a subscription to the New York Times. The same thing could be true for social media. If we allow all of it, people can make informed decisions about what they want to watch or listen to. So my main kind of thrust is, instead of limiting more and more regulation and having social media be more regulated, what if we let it be open? Fake news has been around since the beginning of time. You go to your local grocery store and you see those little newspapers out there which says aliens have landed, Kanye and Kim Kardashian are going to get divorced. All these fallacies.
Oh, that's true.
I'm just kidding. But the bottom line is that it's been around for a long time. And so this is nothing different. All that's happened with technology is it's exposed humanity more and faster. So all we need to do is actually limit our regulations and then let people make informed choices about what they want to watch, what they want to see.
Quick question though. One thing about it is, back with the Prodigy lawsuit and when it came into being, we're saying social media now, we're applying it to social media, but there wasn't social media at the time, unless you're talking about AOL chat rooms. That would be the closest thing I can think of. And yes, I'm old. Okay. I admit it, folks. But that was more bulletin boards and forums, I believe, which, were like just giant, they're like the YouTube comment section, only on sites. Do you think that some of this is spun out of control because they're applying it to newer technology with algorithms and people who are manipulating them at the top?
I think that's definitely true. Absolutely. I don't know about spun out of control. It's just gone a direction that people didn't expect, and it's more in people's faces than they thought in the initial stages. It's still communication. It's still words. Back then, there probably wasn't much video and there was less images. But I think it's the same thing. I just think that what's happening right now is that we have battling parties, so to speak, who want to really, really regulate what the speech is that's allowed on social media platforms. And that's repugnant to me. I hate when we say we can't have this we can't communicate this, we can't communicate that. So yeah.
Well, the interesting thing, the Section 230, and my understanding of the history of it, and I think it's accurate, there was the Prodigy, and I think there was the CompuServe lawsuits. There were two lawsuits. I forget the name of both. One of them held that the platform that did no moderating was actually in a better position than the platform that attempted to do some moderating, because in attempting to do some moderating and removing illegal or defamatory content, they made themselves liable for that which remained on the platform. And they were, in the initial stages, were only going after overtly illegal stuff, the CP stuff, like the really bad stuff. And they said 230 came in and said, look, if a platform is going to try to moderate, they shouldn't be penalized for it and give impunity to those who do no moderation. And so 230 came in and said, if you try to comply with the law, remove illegal content, lascivious or whatever,
Yes.
then you will not be held liable.
Yeah.
And what did it turn into by the courts was just blanket immunity to any platform to effectively remove and whatever they want, and they can't be sued for it because of Section 230 immunity. So I've always said the law was pretty clear and the intent was there. It was the courts that sort of expanded this to absolute immunity, and it just takes a Supreme Court decision to circumscribe that immunity.
Well, I don't know that it was the courts necessarily. It's the language. I mean, it's otherwise objectionable. I mean, that's the main thrust of the language that allows it to have blanket immunity. I part of me says I don't know that there's a problem with that. I keep hearing people saying we need to further limit the protections of or further constrain our speech online, but I don't see any value to it this time. Someone can come up with a reason that I would listen to it, but that's kind of my position on it.
Nick, I know that you have definite views, and you and I have trod a little bit of the same ground with, shall we say, a fiery, I would say, mentally troubled potential lawyer out there. But it's good for views. I'm not going to put any of you with the same category as Linwood. Okay, I have had to read the comment section on that, and that is really disturbing stuff.
But so Lynn was just banned from Twitter. His legal fund was also banned from Twitter, and I got into it a little bit. I covered this on my show, and someone in my comment section was saying, well, but he said terrible things about Chief Justice John Roberts. And I'm like, well, so? Yeah. Like, I mean, so? And the person's argument was, well, they violated Twitter's rules or terms of service. For one, I'm not entirely sure what Linwood said that violated Twitter's terms of service. I mean, he said a bunch of stuff, and I'm sure many people would categorize it as absolutely insane. But he doesn't actually call for harassment. The biggest call that he made that I saw was for Chief Justice John Roberts to step down, which if we can't ask can't ask a political figure to step down, or if that's somehow targeted harassment, I don't know what targeted harassment is anymore. And the other argument was that, well, the things that he was saying were libelous and stuff like that. And it's like, but people libel me all the time on Twitter. And yeah, I can sue them, but I can't get them removed from Twitter for it. Like they could, I've been accused of all sorts of federal felonies, which are all ridiculous because I'm just some weirdo in a basement. But that doesn't make me somehow able to stop people's speech online. And I'm much more in line with Ian's thought, and going kind of back to what he was talking about. When this country was founded, and as we're developing these laws and amendments and protections, we have to remember that the social media of the day was the town newspaper, and any town had at least one. And that's a minimum. When you talk getting into bigger cities, you have newspapers that are distributed by hand, on the streets. So you're dealing with 20 to 30 newspapers in a single metropolitan area. And many of them are absolutely insane. But they so valued the freedom to disseminate that information that there was no check on it. The check was, do you trust this newspaper? Do you trust this journalist? And if you don't buy it. And that's what, for a brief period, YouTube and other platforms were. We were going back to this sort of idea that journalists and journalist outlets don't have this implied authority and neutrality that they've been riding on for 50 to 60 years of the recent history. It was actually, they had to earn trust because there was so much competition, and now that's going away. And when I see Jack and Mark Zuckerberg up on Capitol Hill telling congressmen, no, we want we want to reform 230. We want to make more regulations because we think regulation is good. I go, wait a minute. They want to drown out their competition. They want to snuff out people, and they want to do it with impunity. And that to me is terrifying.
Well, good news. We have somebody here to stand in for everybody in the press and all journalists. And so to answer for the sins of all media, we have Alison Morrow.
I'm writing down a lot of notes. Does that make me a lawyer for the day? So I have a lot of thoughts on this. The first thing I'll say is that, I mentioned that I studied theology. I have a Master of Divinity degree. And one of the things that I took away from my theology training that I apply today is the translation of the Bible into the vernacular languages of the people that then started reading it and then said, wait a second, that's not what you guys have been telling us for the last, 1,000 years. Like, what's going on here? And started kind of taking the truth, I guess, like you were talking about, into their own hands. And I believe that led to a whole slew of changes in the way government was formed and enacted. And I do believe we're kind of in that next information revolution. The way I look at these platforms is a new translation of what the sort of priestly class has been telling us for years. And I do think that's why you're seeing kind of this mounting frustration. And I do think part of what we saw on Wednesday was some of that. And that's one of the videos that I did, was talking about, like, what is our role, those of us who have been in journalism for so long, like, what was our role in all of this, and the just absolute distrust that people have in us right now. And so that's one thing. The other is that, I do believe it's also affected media in the sense that we all have seen how reporters have started to ask questions or write in a way that is going to grab them attention on these platforms too. And so that's kind of accelerated things in the sense that now when you're listening to White House press conferences, are you hearing questions that are helpful to the public, or are you hearing questions that are going to sound good for a Twitter audience? That's another thing. As far as what I believe the competition serves to put a check on that, because I do think, again, there's been this negative effect that social media has had on journalism simply because of the ego and narcissism, I think, that's affected, well, everybody in that sense, if you watch The Social Dilemma, but it's the focus on negativity and the polarization. And if people want to, they can just go down these holes, but it does offer a check on that. You do have the opportunity to find alternative views if you're somebody who wants to open your mind and see other perspectives. So I hope that that's going to eventually lead us to a place where people have an opportunity to become a little bit more complex thinkers about what's going on around us. And that, I can go 20 minutes on a topic if I want to, whereas it used to be that I had to keep things to 90 seconds. Is that going to open up an opportunity for that? But as far as, how journalists see this right now, and I've unfortunately seen so many of them be on the side of, we need to take down information. We need to take down information because is it a morality thing? Like, we really feel like we're standing in between the public and just the end of society as we know it. So we really feel like we're the sort of messiahs of truth, and we need to put ourselves in the way so that people don't just destroy everything that we know to be dear to us. Or is it a competition thing? Is it like, that those people are just, that's the Wild West, the rogue people out there, and they're just, they're not vetted like we are. They don't have the editors we do. They don't have the same safety mechanisms. And so there's a lot there when it comes to how this affects journalism, how journalism has affected this. I will say I tend to be quite a purist when it comes to what I want to see, simply because, again, as we've seen in mainstream news, once you have gatekeeping, which you do obviously in mainstream news,
Sure.
Then you have to ask, who is the gatekeeper and who's that going to be? And so who's the gatekeeper at NBC? Who's the gatekeeper at CBS, Fox News Channel? I've worked at all, the different affiliates. I've worked in national cable news. There's always somebody or a group of people who's deciding what is going to fit this particular narrative or what is good for our audience. And so the same thing happens on social media. And if you're a journalist like myself who's saying, you know what, I'm not totally sure that the way this is being talked about in mainstream news is full to the extent of the truth here. And so I want to give you some other options. it frankly has become to the point where they've upheld corporate news, right? We've seen that they've come out and said corporate news is now going to be our authority.
I have
which
a
is
question on
weird.
that real quick to interrupt. Sorry, I apologize, but you mentioned corporate news. And I noticed that corporate news is leading on YouTube. Like it's always featured, even though Tim Pool, for example, pulls in way more views than any of the media outlets. Is this a nice case, though, where that same media outlet is not only putting content on YouTube, but they're paying advertising to YouTube to be seen, if you will, in other videos? You know, kind of like, I hate to say pay to play, but I do kind of wonder if corporate media is in fact doing a little pay to play. And sorry to interrupt on that.
No, it's okay. I don't know the answer to that. I just know that they've been pretty open about the fact that they feel the dangers of the independents out there. And so they have to put the corporate news channels in front of us. But those of us who have worked for corporate news, and even those of us who haven't worked for corporate news, if you have half a brain, realize that these companies do not always get it right. So it's one of those things where you set up, where do you break that circle? Because you're going to be feeding more of this information. Those of us who are on the outside of that are kind of being suppressed. I've gotten knocks on community guidelines stuff that just don't make any sense, but you could have the same message on a corporate news station, and it's more than likely you're not going to get the strike. Why is that? Is it because they're lower risk? Is it because they have more attorneys working for them? Is it because they all go to the same cocktail parties in Silicon Valley? I don't totally know, but it is starting to become the same thing. It's starting to become, it went from being this place where I remember my mom giving me a little blue camera in 2007 when I was graduating from BU. And she's like, it says upload directly to YouTube on it, because I was going back into news, and I gave it back to her. I'm like, Mom, no serious journalist is on YouTube. And if I started my YouTube channel back then and just quit mainstream media, I'd probably, I'd have a small empire at this point. But now here I am, hustling and doing 2021. But it's just now it's turned into the opposite. It's not necessarily the place where I'm so glad I have the ability to be out there and that there are people who can still talk. But it's not the same as it was 10 years ago. There's definitely the propping up now of YouTube at least becoming a place where it's hard to distinguish between, YouTube and corporate media. It kind of has sort of the same energy.
It is part of the design, is that what ended up, and I've seen it because I've been on YouTube but not doing this type of content since 2014. The party came to YouTube. Media, legacy media, or what people call legacy media, television news, lost its audience. Everybody knew it. They lost control of dissemination of information. They lost control of honing the information, framing it before anybody could see it themselves. Twitter helped a little bit as well, where you could get the information without the filter of mainstream media, without the bias and the spin and the narrative. And they saw that. And now they don't care if they come over here and just turn YouTube, with its billions of people who are on it, into the wasteland that mainstream media has become, because at the very least they can control the narrative where the people are. And then there'll be, other platforms that are going to rise and try to compete, become what YouTube was. Right. And then it's an interesting thing, spinning it back to the 230. It's an interesting question. Is the 230 reform now to basically monopolize where the party is and make it so that the reform makes it impossible for competitors to come up and compete, because it'll be prohibitively costly if and when they no longer have the same immunity that allowed YouTube to grow?
Well, I've got you, Viva. That actually rolls into a couple super chats that came in. But what about Section 230 regulation BS algorithms? It means little if YouTube or Twitter can just algorithm you into nothingness. Quote, I made a video criticizing cuties, and I went from 900,000 impressions to less than 50,000 in a week. They can just choke the life out of anyone who seems like they may be a problem. How can this be prevented? Or can it be prevented? I bring this up because I know, David, Viva, that you have put out multiple videos of all kinds of chicanery. I think you have a whole playlist of it. You put a video out, all of a sudden it disappears or shadow banned, and we go through. I just released a video last night myself with Will Riley. He is both a PhD and lawyer, and he is a professor at Kentucky State University. We were talking about hate crime hoaxes and all that. Guess what? It's already been yellow flagged because of content. And I don't know, am I supposed to challenge that? Because if I challenge it and then they say I'm wrong, then they're going to say, well, we can't trust you. We're going to sync your content. And I know you've talked about that. So Enlighten us.
It goes one step beyond that. So I had the same issue with the super chat just mentioned. One of my Supreme Court analyses decisions in 48 hours gets 135,000 views, got green lighted, all of a sudden demonetized, confirmed on manual review that I never asked for. In the next 48 hours, it gets like 2,000 views, 3,000 views. Other videos, which were manually approved, they were yellow lighted. I asked for review, got green lighted. I go back and they've been yellow lighted sometime later without my knowledge after it had been manually approved. And that happened more than once. The algorithm is a more interesting thing because it's one thing to be able to put your content up there without it being removed, flagged, or whatever. But then the question is, are you entitled to the algorithmic, what's the word I'm looking for, benefit or detriment? That, I don't know where that fits in on 230 insofar as the algorithm can effectively sync any content, but I'm not sure that Section 230 would entitle you to algorithmic neutrality, although I suspect it should. But Ian, I think you have an opinion there.
Well, I just think people have to distinguish between entitlement. I think, and I don't mean to speak to this commenter in the pejorative, but you do have to realize that these are private sector businesses, and their primary job is to make money, and their primary job is to sell advertising. And gosh darn it, right now we're on YouTube, and I'm not paying a thing, and it's an amazing thing. So you got to go into it. I think where Section 230 comes in is to ensure fairness. I think that's what law should come in to do, is ensure fairness, not to control, manipulate. You can put on, Republican content, but you can't put on Democratic content. No, to keep it fair. And so I think that, we could go into a lot of crazy things that YouTube does. I spend my days consulting with different larger creators, and this is what we spend all day long on, is how can we get back their channel? How can we get the copyright strike off? So there's lots of crazy stuff. But you also have to have that 29,000 foot view, which is, okay, you are using this platform for free. You are having an audience for free. So you got to deal with some of those problems as they come up. When you switch over to Section 230, I think we're just talking about fairness. We just have to have the playing field fair, and no voice should be pushed down artificially by government.
Can I say one thing about the algorithm versus what else might be going on behind the scenes that I just noticed? So I was looking at one of my old stations, and they have a series running. I've never seen videos that have 350 dislikes versus, 3 likes, right? It's so obvious that people just didn't like this. But it's still, it still makes the rounds. So that I've always had that question is, okay, so, if it really was just kind of this machine that's just, hey, this is just popular and we're going to push it forward. Why do you see videos like you were talking about, Eric, where PolitiFact, for instance, will be talking about, with my Antifa video, I saw that it got 1 million views, and then YouTube was like, she's had enough. We're going to shut her down. I literally overnight saw it drop from 250,000 views a day to 1,000 maybe, and it just you could see, because we can see our analytics, like you can see how the numbers change. So you have something that organically should be continuing to grow,
or even shrinking, gradual sloping down,
or something like that. Exactly. Right. Yeah. Not just overnight. It just goes from 250,000 views a day to like 50. But then you also see videos that have 400 views on the same topic, plus also have a ton of dislikes on the video, and they're still somehow making it. So how are they tweaking the system there too? That I don't totally understand. And again, that's a corporate news outlet, which, just back to that point as well, as somebody who watched my news ownership company go from saying, that's dumb, we're not going there, to, hey, maybe we could make some money over there, so we should start figuring this out. Their YouTube channels often suck. I hate to say it that way, but they're terrible at YouTube. They have terrible thumbnails. They have terrible descriptions. The videos are terrible. They're just news. It's not what people necessarily want to watch when they go to YouTube. They like people talking and ranting and that kind of stuff. They don't necessarily want a 90-second news package. But how is that stuff making it in front of people so much more often when it's not even necessarily what YouTube, it's as far as sort of the way that I believe most people go to YouTube for. All of that just seems weird to me.
Well, Nick, while we're speaking of ranting, I'm going to go to you on that. And I just random. You just hadn't talked to her. There's no illusion that's taken place at all there. But,
so
she brought up.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, man. She brought up something about the corporate, and actually Ian brought up corporate owns blah blah blah. What about the argument? Because I do believe in a private business can do what the hell they want and shut things down if they want. Blah 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 blah. But what happens when the regulations and everything is set into place and the network effect is in place? That, for example, Twitter becomes the public square. where they essentially have a monopoly on all the speech. How do you feel about that? Should they face more pressure to be more open about what goes on there?
I feel like maybe you've watched my Marsh versus Alabama video.
Oh, sorry, I missed that one. But
oh, you did. Okay, so there's an old case, and actually, what was interesting about this to me is Roseanne Barr tweeted out this case sometime over the past couple of years and said that it was precedent to force social media to stop its censorship, and she was wrong. Because it's dead. It's a dead case. It died with the Mall of America. Interestingly enough, thank you, Minnesota, for doing that. But Marsh versus Alabama was a case where a corporate town, and if you don't know what that was, corporations, typically large manufacturers, used to own an entire town. They would own a
company,
section of land,
and a company store, even better.
Right. And so they would own the housing, they would own the roads, everything was private. And Jehovah's Witness, who are true champions of free speech throughout history, wanted to distribute their pamphlets on the corporate town sidewalks, and they were told no. And they had to actually leave the town and leave the private road section of the town to do it. Now, when I say the town had all of the functions of government, it did. It had a police force that was private. It had a private post office that had a contract with the regular post office. So everything was owned there. And the Supreme Court determined that once a corporation or a private entity owned the entire sort of realm of government for a space, that they could, or that they were bound by the Constitution in the way a government would be. And this makes a lot of sense, right? We can't just privately carve out a section of freedom in the United States or of oppression in the United States. We all have to be bound by the Constitution when we control all access to something. So Marsh versus Alabama is dead, but there's no reason we can't apply the spirit and principle to Marsh versus Alabama to social media when it becomes what you're talking about. And I think Twitter and Facebook are there in large part, and it's because they stepped in and embraced those government accounts. They stepped in and they saw an opportunity to make a ton of money, to be the place where civic discussion took place. And I think we can look into the idea that once a place does become a public square, it is incumbent upon them to uphold the Constitution and be bound in the same way that the public square is. And I think there's plenty of ways for websites to avoid doing that if they want, with clear terms of service, with clear guidelines about what is and what isn't accepted. And the resistance I get from people on that idea is that, well, they don't see how that is happening now, and it's because it's not. But the idea that we don't know what something looks like doesn't mean we can't craft something that looks good. So I think that there is a space for doing that. But I want to go real quickly back to something we were talking about, because it goes back into this news content being pushed that was just spoken about a minute ago. I don't know if you guys saw this. It was a couple years ago, but Ben Shapiro was outdoing all of major media on Facebook, and on his video content. I mean, he was killing them on YouTube, and Steven Crowder, I believe, was too. And then literally one day, there was a news blurb about it, and it flipped. And the news networks started crushing everybody on YouTube, no matter how terrible their content was. They had no effort in the thumbnails.
The Young Turks, too, are always promoted. The Young Turks are always up there, and they're not as popular as they claim, because you look at the view count compared to like Tim Pool again, and they're weak.
There was, I believe, a very big buy-off from mass media. Young Turks is likely, I don't know if they're riding the algorithm or if there's some sort of preferred content that's allowed, or if they contributed in because they got so big. I'm not sure what it is, but there is definitely, or I shouldn't say there's definitely, there is probably a mass buy-off that happened. And it was literally a one-day switch. And that's that pay-to-play idea that you mentioned earlier. There is a pay-to-play on YouTube with those companies. I don't know how you get access to it, but all of their content gets promoted. All of it.
There we go.
Nick, I mean, about the thing, Marsh versus Alabama, or Marsh v. Alabama, the problem is the argument has been there. I've been sort of following that line of reasoning for a couple of years now, saying, everybody's been saying it. It's a public square, whether or not they are private enterprises. They existed due to subsidies, tax benefits, whatever. But they've tried it. PragerU tried the argument. I forget who else. There were a couple of people. They tried the argument. The courts aren't going to follow that reasoning. So the question is now, knowing that the courts are not going to go that line of reasoning because it's been tried and failed, what's the way to go about it now? And I think Clarence Thomas gave the indication with his 10-page judgment on Section 230 that, the historical context of 230 was one thing, how it's being used and abused today is another. And so we need one of those cases because the courts are not buying into the corporate town argument for.
But David, just because the courts aren't buying into it doesn't mean we can't pass laws. I mean, you know what I'm saying? The courts review the constitutionality of our laws, but it's up to Congress and the president to a certain extent to actually have laws passed. So I don't know that because the courts aren't buying it is a good reason not to further develop fairness for free speech on social media.
There's a mindset. I'm going to jump in because Alison, and I'm picking on Alison today. I'm sorry, but she had a lawyer on who just blew my mind
in so many ways.
He went off on Clarence Thomas about how he was inappropriate, and idiotic, and uneducated, something like that. I mean, I don't think I'm exaggerating, am I?
No.
And that decision. So there's already a mindset by, shall we say, quote, legal scholars that a lot of this is good. I mean, this lawyer is teaching internet law. I mean, he is an internet law guy, and he's like, but we can't have this garbage on there.
Yeah, there's that woman that wrote I can't remember her name, but I actually think she was on Joe Rogan, so she's gotten some views. She works at Stanford at their internet whatever think tank, whatever they have there that studies the internet at Stanford. And she wrote an article, actually she's written several, about the dissociation from reality of the right and how this has to be dealt with. And these shaming words of for the tech companies for, at least they finally got to it. It may be late, but better than never. And there is definitely not just within the media, corporate media, traditional journalism, but also in the universities pushing this kind of stuff. And as you were mentioning him, well, okay, they're all kind of from, in that area, that's Silicon Valley. So he's at Santa Clara, but what exactly is that? And how, I really do believe, maybe this is an oversimplification, but whatever. I was in mainstream news, so that's what we do, right?
90-second hit, go. Yeah,
exactly. I feel like there are sort of two kinds of people, and I'm willing to debate this, but there's the one kind of person that's just like, there's a limit. There has to be a limit because we can't have this, and this. There are the people who really do feel like there's a serious danger if we just let people communicate wildly on the internet. And then there's the other side that's like, well, but who's going to be the person that determines where the line in the sand is going to be drawn? So you know what? No, I just want it all. And I'm that kind of person. I'd rather take the risk because I don't want to lose the good information. Take COVID, for instance. There have been a lot of whistleblowers that have come out of the COVID world that it's been important to hear from them, medical professionals. Who in Silicon Valley has a medical degree that should be telling a guy who's like, ventilators are killing people, maybe we shouldn't be putting everybody on ventilators? Like, do you want a guy with a tech degree, working for Facebook, deciding that guy shouldn't tell you to not put somebody? I want to know so that if I get COVID and somebody wants to put me on a ventilator and be like, hey, I saw a guy on YouTube, I don't want that.
Sorry, that's not the general consensus, Alison.
What'd you say?
I'm sorry, that's not the general consensus. We don't have time for that.
And it's just like, but who gets to decide? And then they use the WHO, for instance, but they've changed their minds on stuff. And so anyway, I just feel like it tends to be kind of one of two ways of looking at it. And it's been interesting that sort of the people and I do kind of think they all run in the same circles, like the same. I hate using the like, oh, down with the establishment kind of talking, because people are always like, you're just a millennial, you hate institutions. It's just because you're a millennial.
I'm an extra, I hate them too.
Yeah. Okay. But still, yeah, it's just one of those things where I think, you're either you're on one or the other side. And I just tend to be a purist about it simply because I really question, like, if you're going to have a gatekeeper, who is it going to be and who determines who that's going to be? And I believe that will always be the person in power. And I don't think they always get it right. In fact, I think a lot of times they get it really wrong. And like going back to the president's account, for instance, what we've seen, with the suspension of his accounts, I was listening to one journalist talk about this the other day, and I think he's right on. He's like, that guy has a button that could like start a war basically or nuke someone. You don't want to know what that guy's thinking. I mean, why are we taking him off the internet? Don't you want to at least know?
It's one step further than that. I've always said, like, you get untenable ideas, you get dangerous ideas. The only way to legitimize those ideas faster, kick them off the platform, because it's not like you silence those ideas. People will find them elsewhere. They're going to say the reason I'm being censored is because they're so true, and also antagonizes those who are in the middle. So banning Trump right now at this time with 2 weeks left in his term. You know what that's going to do? And they know it damn well. It's going to invigorate and it's going to irritate and it's going to antagonize those who are already angry, and they know it. And my theory is they know exactly what they're doing. They're doing it deliberately to antagonize a response from people now so that they can further justify further draconian measures. But censorship, you don't need to be a rocket scientist or be the oldest person in the world to know that it doesn't work. And what it actually does is the exact opposite effect. And I'm convinced YouTube knows it, and I'm convinced Facebook knows it, and Twitter. And in doing what they're doing it specifically to try to get even more of an extreme reaction out of people who have already reacted extremely.
This is what I worry about, and I'm curious what you guys thinking. I could be completely off base, but I am genuinely scared that by pushing these messages down, I mean, I look at some of the comments that are coming in, and they actually worry me that there are some people who are very upset and very deluded. And the problem is that while I feel like the left, if you will, Antifa types are violent and they cause a lot of problems, the really, shall we say, troubled people who sometimes come out of the right, have you ever heard of the Turner Diaries? They heard of Ruby Ridge. Ever hear of Waco? The problem I see is if they push all this down, the Turner Diaries is like a practically banned book. It's all underground. Are we going to have another Timothy McVeigh? And I'm sorry, I genuinely worry about that, because when somebody goes off the rails that is that far right, if you will, they do have real carnage. And I'm terrified of that. Am I off base in my worries?
No and yes. Let me give you a lawyer answer. It depends.
That'll be $1,000. You forgot the second part, Dick.
I'm not sure. That's right. I'm not sure if it's. High profile, scary people have been on the right, of course, but high profile, scary people have been on the left. It's just interesting that they wind up in government. Thanks
a lot, buddy. Keep the super chats, please.
I think there's an interesting sort of interplay between what we're talking about, the suppression of ideas, maybe driving people underground, and maybe having the sort of pressure cooker explode, so to speak, where things are capped off, and then it happens. And we might see that on the right more, but maybe that has to do with the suppression of a certain line of thinking.
That's what I'm talking about. Yes.
Right. But I don't know that it's limited to left versus right. I think it'd be interesting if left ideas were suppressed in the same way, if we would get the same result. And arguably we kind of have. I think it just manifests out differently. I mean, we talk about riots back in '68. We talk about, I don't know if you guys remember, but there was this year 2020 where like several cities were on fire for a large period of time. And it's like everybody forgot about that over the past couple of days, at least in the journalism world, where suddenly riots and protests are bad, but they were good for a whole year. But so I think it does manifest differently, but I know who you're talking about in the comments, because I know the video subjects you've covered recently that mirror some of my own. And there's a lot of talk about really terrifying prospects, but I do think that that's important to be out in the open. And I wanted to go back because, this is how I do things. I'm going to go back to like 10 minutes ago.
Oh, perfect.
But Viva and Ian had an exchange about what was you know, with March versus Alabama being dead in the courts and what the alternatives are. And that's why I wanted to make sure it was clear that March versus Alabama is dead in the courts. The courts are not a viable path for this. I know PragerU did that, and they made the wrong argument, and maybe PragerU has made the wrong argument in several places before, but we're not going to get into that. But anyway, the idea is that, one, we have the legislative option, which Ian's talking about. Two, Viva was talking about bringing the proper case before someone like Clarence Thomas. And I do think there is room there. It's not March versus Alabama, but if Clarence Thomas is indicating that they're wanting or needing to reinterpret 230 and how it's applied, I mean, the answer is in the publisher versus distributor distinctions that are there. We have the publisher protections.
Of course, the guy said there's no difference.
I'm sorry. What's that?
Allison's guy literally said they're the same thing.
Yeah, well, that guy is wrong, and maybe his voice should be silenced on social media. But no, the idea that publishers and distributors are treated equally under the law is just an ignorant position. There's not much else to say about it. That we don't have publisher and distributor distinctions on social media doesn't mean that they're not there in traditional media. And in traditional media, those publishing decisions that are made are still treated without 230 because they're not a digital platform unless the books are released digitally, and then they've got some sort of protection on that sort of release. But if Simon and Schuster, for example, had a book that they were going to print, maybe by Josh Hawley, nope, that's not going to happen. Okay, someone else. Maybe Milo, nope, not that one. Maybe someone else. No, so they're going to print a book, and then some bad actor at the printing press actually inserts images of CP into that book, right? And that thing goes out. The people who ship the book, the stores who sell the book, are not going to be liable for that CP. They're distributors. They have no concept of what's in there. Simon and Schuster might not be liable if they can plausibly argue that they didn't know it was going on, because at that point they became a distributor. No, they send the manuscript in, and the printing press is the one who makes it. At that point, are they publishing the bad thing, or is the printing press doing it? And they can argue that they're a distributor and that their publishing aspects have changed. And then anyone who's not responsible for that is not going to be held liable until they receive actual notice that the thing has happened. So someone gets a copy of the book, they flip to page 26, and they're like, oh my God. And they call them up and say, how dare you do this? What happened? And then at that point they're on notice, and they have to start pulling them off of shelves. They have to make sure that nothing happens. A publisher doesn't get that actual notice step. The publisher has notice because they're the ones creating the content and putting it out there. So they're clearly treated differently. And if we gave that publisher distributor distinction under 230, if we decided that at some point you become a publisher when you make these editorial decisions, and that's what people like Ted Cruz have been talking about in congressional hearings, then we can actually carve out these sort of things. And it can be done legislatively, but I think also there is a path through the courts to tailor 230 in that way. And we've seen them hack up legislation before, but I actually think that brings it back to what it was intended to be. 230 was a shield for reasonable moderation of illegal content. They just added a 3-word phrase, otherwise objectionable content, at the end, and that killed the bill's intent when it was manipulated and abused over time.
Ian, here's the claim essentially written out again by a chatter that agrees with the lawyer Alison saying. Is this true that there's, quote, no distinction between publisher and platform in 230 or not? Is that what maybe some of the confusion is, that it's not actually written in 230, but there is a difference between a publisher and a platform?
Yes, I essentially that's true. I do want to, I'm going to pull a Nick here. I do want to bring it back a little bit to the initial question you had, which is, gosh, there could be a lot of harm as a result of free speech. You know what I'm saying? You could encourage someone to do something bad or whatever. And I hate
that's not free speech. That's a call to action. And
yeah,
there are laws against that, right? If I say, David, don't hit Allison, then I've just said, I've asked him to do that. That's different. That's not speech.
Well, yeah, you're right. There are destructive talk or speech is definitely something that can be prohibited. But I do think that there's such a large line that we should err on the side of allowing the speech. And the reason why I do that is I think the problem we have right now is that our society has been trained to look up to authority, publishers. And I think the problem is that the reason for that is because there's been so much censorship. I think at some point in time when all the information is available, then people will trust less and think better. And so I think that one of the things, Nick was talking about doing more legislation, and Ted Cruz has talked about, carve outs and think there's two different ways to change 230. I actually tend to think that we should resist that, because I think that over time, allowing more content will allow people to not trust as much and not worry about fake news as much, because they're not trusting it. They're seeing the social media platforms for what they are: private sector business making billions of dollars on advertising. That's what they should be. They are not purveyors of truth. And so that's one of the things I wanted to bring back, is that it may sound callous to say, oh my gosh, allow more speech to encourage people to do bad things. I know that's horrible, but that's just the price of freedom. And that's what's so wonderful about the United States. If you go to different countries, they don't place the same value on free speech that we do. It's fundamental in America. It's First Amendment. I mean, it's sacred. And so I think we need to honor that when it comes to social media.
I actually agree.
Also, where did the idea that dangerous things just will start happening because of the internet? I mean, has anybody seen what's happened over the last couple thousands of years? I mean, people were able to do really bad things without the internet. So it may accelerate that. But yeah, it's not like all of a sudden AOL chats came on and now it's like, oh, game over for society as we know it. Yeah. I just think that it's a misnomer to think that, like, you have to ask that efficacy question, and whether this sort of fear mongering is something that's real to form to like this new world that we're in, or if that was always a possibility. And it really has always been a possibility. People will find each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I want to clarify something to the chat you brought up. I was not saying there's a distinction between publishers and distributors in 230. I'm talking about in traditional media, in what we traditionally think of as publishing. There is a distinction there. 230 has eliminated that distinction because 230 prevents any civil liability from moderation practices of any kind as it's currently read. So the chatter is correct that there's no distinction in the law. And that's what
maybe that's the problem.
Well, no, the problem, and Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no distinction between platform and publisher in 230, but 230 gives immunity to platforms and not to publishers, which is why New York Times can get sued for defamation, but YouTube can't. So there is a legal distinction that has been drawn up and that has been distinguished between platforms and publishers. Section 230 gives immunities, so the likes of Twitter, YouTube, Facebook cannot be sued, but it does not give it to publishers, which is why New York Times, CNN routinely get sued.
Unless it's
one more thing I want to bring up. It's third-party liability. It's liability for third-party content. Right. You got to make sure, because YouTube can be sued if they put out like a video that's libelous or slanderous or something. They can be sued still. It's just for third parties on the platform anyway.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to echo, is that on New York Times' website, for example, NewYorkTimes.com, if a commenter comes in and starts making a bunch of murder threats against their, ex-wife, then New York Times would get the similar 230 protection in that instance. So because they're not the publisher of the content. And there is a distinction between platforms and the actual publisher of the statement in question, or the actual publisher of the comment or the content. But when I'm talking publisher versus distributor, because we use publisher for so many different things, the publisher of a statement is just whoever communicates a statement under defamation law. But when I'm talking about a traditional publisher, and that's why I brought up Simon & Schuster, is Simon & Schuster publishes books. And so, but or let's go with Marvel. Marvel publishes comics, but Diamond Distribution, up until COVID hit, was the sole distributor of comic books. And so Diamond Distribution would never be liable for something that Marvel put in their books unless they had noticed that they were distributing illegal content. Then their liability could change.
How about Netflix and cuties? No, I'm curious, because the curation can come into effect. And Netflix didn't make the movie, I don't think. They just chose to distribute it. Could they be liable for it or no?
Isn't Cuties a Netflix original? Like, didn't they buy it and put their name on it?
I think so. That's what I'm.
Oh, if they did, then I guess they own it. But I'm just okay. Well, what about something else? I mean, is there some kind of gray area in some of that? You know, like HBO buys and shares a particular movie.
Well,
That's the oh, sorry, I don't mean to step on you. I'll keep it quick. That's the interesting distinction that we have with platforms going from traditional mass media to digital media and having 230 in there. Is there's this hybridized link? Is HBO Max merely are they like or HBO Go or whatever it is now? Are they considered a traditional publisher because they're on the internet, but they more mirror like the regular cable content that they were doing, and they're choosing the third party content. There is no like random upload to HBO Go, for example. So I don't know. I genuinely don't know the answer to that. I would argue that they shouldn't be protected for 230 because they're making every single decision, but they fall under the same definitions in 230 of a platform. So the question then becomes, are they the publisher?
So
or
curation would imply a publication.
Netflix was indicted in Texas on cuties. So they're whether or not I don't know what defenses they're going to raise in terms of not being the curators or the publishers of the content, or whether it's not just obscene content in the first place. They were in fact indicted.
Right. And 230, if I'm not mistaken, if any of you guys know for sure, let me know. I believe it does have a carve out that says it does not make any particular criminal act void under state or federal law. So 230 is merely a civil liability shield and does not protect you from what could otherwise be an unlawful act. Although I think that the Netflix would certainly argue that it should protect them, that the spirit of it is destroyed if you allow criminal prosecution from some small county to go through, that would destroy the effective protections of 230 and that should be ignored or severed out. But I think it is written in there that there's no immunity from criminal liability.
Okay, I got a cool super chat, and we saw a pay-to-play with Scientology in 2008. After the Scientology keyword got full of videos exposing them, they paid to have all the recommended videos on their videos be only their content. Have you heard of this, Allison, or...
What? Because I'm from Florida, where the headquarters are of Scientology. You think I know
everything?
everything?
Well, I didn't say that, but out yourself. I didn't know if you had heard this news. You know, you're the intrepid reporter.
Yeah, it's funny though. But I grew up literally in the hometown of their headquarters. So
I have like Rekieta.
I have
Allison,
not heard that.
Blink twice if you're not allowed to answer this question.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I honestly, I don't know the answer, but it would not surprise me. It would not surprise me. But that's all I can say about Scientology at this moment, because I do go visit my parents every once in a while at Clearwater Beach, and I'd like to survive.
Is it possible? I'm just curious. Is it possible that you can buy or hijack a keyword like that?
I'll just answer. I don't know the specifics of the case, but the answer is absolutely yes. Guys, I don't want to go divulge confidences, but I hear so many stories when I work with creators, and I got to tell you, when you get to the higher levels, it's a different freaking game. When you got 50 million subs and you're drawing 10 million views in 24 hours, it's a different game, guys. And I got to tell you, I don't want to be like any, conspiracy theorist or something like that, but I hear it. And, I'm bound by attorney-client privilege on some of this stuff. But the bottom line is, yeah, if you get to a certain level, YouTube and you are partners, literal partners.
That totally makes sense that it would be that way, though, because in news, it's kind of the same way. The higher you get up in the network cable world, where you're making $8 million a year as your salary, or you're the corporation that's making a ton versus, say, some small independently owned local news station, the games are, rules of engagement are very different for that too. And that's not just for what you're doing and how you're doing it, but who you're having. I mean, let's just put it this way. We didn't book CIA agents for our shows in Knoxville, Tennessee, but I see them regularly on CNN. So it doesn't just, it's just interesting, like the talking points themselves, who's the government and the news stations and their affiliations and the way that they all work with one another. And so it would totally make sense that in YouTube, you'd see kind of the same thing. The higher up you'd get, there would just be more of these relationships that take you away from kind of that independent way of working.
I've heard this too, and Ian, maybe you can confirm if you've worked with them, that we'll say Mr. Smith is a giant creator to protect myself, but Mr. Smith will deliberately make a video saying Mr. Smith is a scam or Mr. Smith is a crook or whatever, and then make a video showing people will say that because I am helping them earn this money, deliberately to own the keywords or the search. So if anybody types in Mr. Smith's a scam or Mr. Smith's thief or whatever it is, it's going to go straight to this massive, powerful creator's video. Have you heard of that kind of thing?
Not specifically that example, but I will just give you one. And that is that I have a number of clients in the finance space, let's put it that way, that end up paying $5,000 a week. And they pay it to people who keep their videos up. So it's right there. It's right there. If you anybody who doesn't believe in pay to play at this stage is not thinking properly.
Okay, somebody just brought up, I guess, a valid point. All you content creators usually give priority to super chats over comments in live chat. You really have the moral right to criticize YouTube if they do the same. Fair point.
Fair question.
It is a fair point.
Well,
I will say, yeah.
Some people call it priority to super chats, and other people are going to say recognizing the support for your content so you can continue doing what you're doing. And I do know that nonetheless, I think, Eric, we're about the same. You do 50-50 bringing up non-super chat questions.
I'm trying to, but you know, as I hang out with you and you bring such a, it's like, it's very, very,
I say it's not a question of favoring the money. It's a question of actually thanking the person who is supporting financially one's ability to continue doing what they're doing. So.
Well, and what I have always said on my channel, and I happen to be something of an expert on super chats.
What is it you say? Is it grift or what's it?
I'm the grift king of 2020. So what I always said is I will interact with the chat. I will interact with the chat. If you want your comments seen, YouTube has a system that puts it right in front of us. And once your chat gets to a certain size, once it gets to a certain level of activity, at some point, the only way you can keep up with the comments, and if you've watched a Viva Barnes live stream about the election, you've seen this. Yeah. There are so many chats coming in.
Streaming.
And that's with 25-second delay. And I have control issues. That's without a moderator. I don't have the Nightbot telling people not to. Not to do that.
But there's
okay, guys, I got to cover this real quickly because I'm still learning how to do the whole bot thing, and sometimes I wind up spamming my chat, which I don't mean to do. So I'm like, okay, wait, I got to have X number of chats between and stuff. But I do think it's helpful. I want to get in there. I was actually going to share that with David so he could have a little reminder saying, just because you super chat, I can't read them all. And I apologize. If you don't feel comfortable, don't donate. So that could be useful for you, David. But
also, isn't there a difference between, reading a super chat and kicking somebody off a platform? In other words, you may, so you see it in front of you, you read it, but that's not a control of that person's ability to interact in the chat and be on the platform itself. It's just, you're just not reading it for whatever variety of reasons. My problem with YouTube is not even necessarily just the AI prioritizes this or that or whatever. It's the actual removal of speech. That's what starts to bother me, because I do think ultimately the responsibility is on the consumer to look for stuff. Hey, do I wish that they would put my stuff in front of people more often? Sure. I just don't like when you get struck off it for questioning things. And I don't know what you guys do on your channels, but I let people say things, probably maybe to their our own detriment, but I do, because I don't want to be a hypocrite at the end of the day.
No,
yeah,
and I figure I will be.
I read every single chat that comes through, every single super chat. Like Viva is saying, that's a thank you, or I see it as a transactional exchange in a way. And not every creator does this, and that's fine. This is what I decided to do a long time ago, and there have been days. Let me tell you, and this is why I've implemented some different policies on my channel. One is that I tend to get to $20 plus chats first. And the reason I did that was because I was getting so many $2 and $5 chats that it would take me 2 to 3 hours to read all of the chats at the end of the show.
And that was
right. And that wasn't a thing I could countenance, because it's either if you have a guest on, especially, they can't stay that long. That's crazy. Well, sometimes, but
well, okay, guys, you got to know that Nick is the late night shock jock attorney amongst us. So his show starts at midnight Eastern.
Oh my God.
And he goes on for 3-4 hours. And no, if it's not enough, he's like, well, I still have some energy. Let me go over to Twitch because it's not daylight yet. So I can't be done.
I sleep from 5 to midnight usually. Well, 6 to midnight or 6 to noon.
PM or AM? Okay.
6 a.m. to noon usually is when I'm asleep.
Wow.
But no, the super chat thing though, again, I don't think it makes us hypocritical, because if you sent a comment to Twitter with money attached, that they would read it. They probably would read it if they're going to accept the money. If not, they're going to just send it back to you and say, we can't accept this or whatever. But so there's a difference between interacting in the chat. And this is what Alison was saying, I think, like, just because you don't donate, that donations or super chats or whatever, they get your interaction with the host or get the attention of the host. But just because you don't super chat doesn't mean you can't participate in the main chat. And I think of the chat as a separate sort of community that builds up. And eventually over a channel's life, a lot of that community will repeatedly show up on schedule, even if they might not be as interested in a particular topic, because they want to talk to the people that they talk to. It's a social media experience in and of itself. So I think there's a distinction there. I'm also trying to protect my grift. Leave me alone.
And Andy Wong actually put a question earlier I thought was really spot on, interesting about the whole platform thing. And he brought up Craigslist as an example, that they started to have to get a little bit careful. And I do vaguely remember that Craigslist, I think, had prostitution running through their or accused of having prostitution or something like that.
There was that famous case with Backpage, right? That changed things.
Right? Yeah.
Remember Backpage.com? Right. There was, I mean, that's one, as I was researching 230, I used to find that come up all the time, that there was that caveat for issues with like Backpage where, you can't, if basically they're not exempt from federal crimes, essentially. You can't just like commit a federal crime on, and then be exempt from that. But I'm not a lawyer again. So
yeah.
You guys.
Well, to get to Mr. Wang's question real briefly, I think the answer is absolutely yes. I think that if we do away with civil liability for social media platforms and internet service providers, we are absolutely going to limit our scope. If you think now we're limited with our freedoms, it's about where we can go and speak. I mean, I'm in California. I mean, we can't go to any restaurant. All the services are closed. No one's going to pay attention to you if you go to a park and give a speech about whatever you want to talk about. So if you think that that's, an issue, wait till it's corporate everywhere. In other words, if social media platforms are liable for any content on their platforms, guess what? This show doesn't appear. Guess what? Nick doesn't, maybe he starts sleeping, between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. A lot of things change and people don't understand that. No one wants bad, hurtful things on, in the public discourse. But the bottom line is, I think if you do a civil liability, those guys say, sure, no problem. So it's Facebook all the time with whatever content they want. It's Google all the time with whatever content Google wants.
Right.
That's true. That comment is absolutely true. And along that line, that's why I used to, at first, when I started reading 230, and I wanted the world to burn, I wanted it gone immediately because I wanted to see Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. I wanted to see them get hit with like 200,000 defamation suits the same day. I thought that would be great. But on the longer view, 230 is an extremely important protection. And what was frustrating was watching Trump suggest that it should be just removed entirely.
Agreed.
That is a punitive measure for the social media companies. And while many of us may want that in some sort of retributive way, if you like what social media can be, there does need to be something to protect third-party liability.
It's a baby bathwater problem, right? I mean, throwing out the baby at the bathwater if you get rid of it.
Well, and it's not just Trump. You're going to see Biden arguing for this too. He's been very clear that he wants to get rid of 230 as well.
Yeah, and that's because they want that sort of control over these things. But if you got to think of 230 this way, if your uncle or cousin or whatever gets really drunk at your house and goes outside and starts shooting a gun into the air, you want them arrested, not you. You want them to be sued if that bullet falls and hits someone, not you. And so we don't really like third-party liability unless that third party unless you are responsible for that third party's action. That's the negligence duty. And the reason 230 exists is because that gets really muddled on the internet. And there was a real way for platforms to be held accountable for actions that they had nothing to do with. Now, I think that has changed dramatically with algorithmic content control and with AI moderation that goes on now. Because, the Nightbot is a vicious, cruel master. But
Nightbot is getting killed in the chat. I mean, there are some very strong feelings about
slay
Nightbot.
that dragon.
I want to see what the Nightbot has to say about Jonathan Ferrier's Russian text here. We're going to see if the Nightbot picks up on that and says,
I don't know. As long as it's not all caps, that would be the first problem.
But yeah, but Google has its own. YouTube has its own built-in automatic moderation that you'll see kick in on streams from time to time, where you will see messages deleted and removed.
Oh, Jonathan.
Okay, well, sorry. There you go.
The Nightbot had to type that into Google Translate.
Yeah, sure.
But this is the crazy thing. And this is why 230, I think there could be carved out exceptions for companies that are big enough, like Apple and Facebook and Twitter, in that if they're doing AI based content moderation and algorithmic content moderation, and they're actually able to review every single thing posted on their site, even though it's 3 million things a minute or whatever it is, it's some ludicrous number. They have a system to actually control it. And the reason I say that is because as it was written, 230 was written with the intent that there's no way anyone could ever possibly moderate all of the content being put out. And we're talking about, at the time, not a lot of content, right? There really wasn't that many GeoCities or Angel Fire pages being made in 1996 every single day. When you compare it to how much stuff is going up on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and they were not able to. There was no technology or physical possibility to moderate all of that content. Now there is. And so I think that there is a way to say, look, if you're going to employ this sort of full scale, full force moderation that you do, then maybe there is at some point a tip off where we can say, okay, you have some liability or you are a public square. But that has to be done.
I got to push back a little bit because they have AI that's doing it, right? Well, we'll say AI because we know that's bullshit. But anyway, essentially, what happens when you try to actually create AI? Did you read that about Microsoft? They created a perfect AI bot on Twitter, and guess what?
Yeah.
It became a Nazi within one day, and they had to shut it down.
Yeah.
Justice for Tay. Give Tay back her autonomy.
Exactly. And then there was another, algorithm that was trying to track cattle, and it wound up just always returning grass because that was the only consistent thing. So the same tools, if you will, that are flagging everything, they're not human. They are machine driven, and I'm saying they're dumb. And at this point, they're useless.
Yeah, it's I don't think they're useless though, and neither does Jack Dorsey. And I think that's the important.
That's who you're quoting.
Look, that was one of the most interesting takeaways of Jack's part of the most recent congressional hearing on 230. Is over and over Jack is saying, we want to be able to. This is an interesting proposition, but he wanted people to be able to create their own bubbles on Twitter. Basically, we want people to have control over the algorithm and allow them to curate their own content. And I think
I'm fine with that. Block anybody you don't like.
Right. And I think that's something we should do and explore. But my point in bringing that up though is Jack and Zuckerberg, they don't think that the AIs are worthless. They certainly don't think that they're even as bad or manipulable as Tay was, or the Chinese AI bots. Did you see those that within like a day were talking about how terrible communism was and singing the praises of capitalism? Hilarious. But AI, the AI for moderation is very, very good on Facebook. And it is overly thorough in many ways. And I genuinely believe that if they wanted to truly moderate, because Twitter will leave cheese pizza, we'll call it, up for a very long time. I thoroughly believe that they have the AI capable to go after some of these things in the way that AI will trigger on various phrases. Currently, I don't think they employ it in that way. That's what scares me, is that they're doing this algorithmic moderation and this AI moderation, but there is selectivity in that moderation as well. And outright illegal content is not moderated by AI in the same way that wrongthink is. And that's a problem. And I don't know how we fix it, but we got to highlight it.
There is one kind of benefit out of all these discussions, all these kind of difficulties with censorship and amending Section 230, and that is that it is forcing more and more people onto different platforms. And I do think the future of social media is actually going to be a much more grouped base. And I say future of social media. It's already happening in China right now, where really platforms are mostly group based about people who have similar interests. And then they can limit the amount of information into their group and eject members and things like that. So I do think that maybe one of the best parts about this whole discussion is that people, sites like, not WeChat, MeChat and Parler are blowing up right now because people are just saying, listen, I like this type of content and I want to talk about this with these type of people, as opposed to having Facebook. I mean, with your pictures of your daughters as well as political talk. So that may be something that's positive about
You
this.
brought up a good point. I've had the CEO of Utreon on, or Utreon on. That's a hard one to roll together. And he stated that, YouTube originally was cat videos, and yes, I'm guilty of it now, and things like that. They're all fun. And then they moved more and more and more into content. But his theory is that YouTube is trying to become Netflix because they see the deep, sweet money of Netflix, and they may be actually moving to allow Utreon and Rumble and BitChute or whatever to kind of pick up everything on the bottom. So maybe, I don't know if it'll open up or not. They seem to be so small that I don't know if they can pick it up or not. But yeah, right on cue. Thank you, Utreon.
The one thing I don't.
That's a grift, Nick, right? Proper grift.
Advertising.
Right on cue. I like that. Yeah.
No, Utreon, when I was interviewing the CEO of Rumble, was super chatting left, right, and center, which is like the best advertising ever.
Hell yeah.
The counterintuitive thing that I always love about all of the censorship, and it goes back to the Snowden tweet, the Snowden quote that someone had messaged. I'd prefer to know what my ideological enemies or threats are saying. And when you push them into their groups, that is exactly how you allow for this hyper, if you want to call it radicalization for lack of a better word, that is exactly how it happens. And it happens not in the plain sight of day, and it's still going to happen regardless. Whereas if you have the open discussion, I saw the YouTube thing about the guy who got radicalized because of the YouTube algorithm. I don't believe it for a second. Okay? Yeah. In as much as he may have gotten radicalized, if that's
he was supposed to come on my show, dude. He was supposed to. So nobody can believe him. He copped out. You were supposed to be on with him. Remember?
If I had known what I knew now, maybe I might have thought twice about. I'd let you interview him first, and then I see how it goes. But in as much as I don't believe that he was actually radicalized by the algorithm, in as much as anybody could be, they can be de-radicalized by actual respectful discussion that exposes and dissects ideas.
The story, if you read the whole story, was that he was a conservative guy, went on conservative channels, went down a couple rabbit holes with Molyneux and whatnot. And by the end, he saw left-wing people that he liked, and he was suddenly de-radicalized and cured. So
and then he's a Democrat. He went from being a conservative to a liberal, you know what I mean? So he actually switched parties.
So, according to the New York Times, if you really read it, he was de-radicalized from the evil right.
So
But the whole story, that whole story was a little bit fishy and dramatic and whatever. Plus, it seems like I got the impression it was looking for affirmation from social media as opposed to being a critique of it. But setting that aside, if the idea is you want to avoid radicalization, and that's the justification for banning people, you have to have no historical or even empirical observational power to know that doesn't work. It achieves the exact opposite, and the only solution is open discussion. And sunlight is the greatest disinfectant.
Totally agree. All right. So to wrap things up, where do we go from here, Ian?
Well, in my perfect world, we would be amending Section 230 to actually reduce regulation. I would keep the civil liability protection for social media platforms and those variants. I would certainly keep the ability of government to control destructive speech as it has now. But I think, as Viva says, as David says, open platforms are better platforms. They bring up more ideas. They allow us freedom of expression. And especially in this day and age when so much of our lives, our in-person lives, are being controlled by government regulations, I find it's the only avenue that we can actually get these ideas out that count. People can criticize, people can accept, people can expand upon, but this is the initial reason why America is what it is. It's founded on ideas of people and being able to express those ideas without fear of damnation.
All right. And Nick the Nose. Hey, yeah. you brought your chatters.
It's fine. It's fine. No, I similar to what Ian was saying, I do think we need to focus on solutions that expand speech. I am for all speech everywhere. I actually want people who have bad ideas to be loud about it so that they can be either talked down or they can be ignored and about their bad ideas up front. I do think there are reasonable reforms that can be made to 230, and some of the proposed changes that were floating around from various government entities were very interesting. And I think it goes around to either removing the otherwise objectionable content portion, because I think that encourages or allows the moderation of content that has nothing to do with illegality, nothing to do with threats, but just has, they can say that can be whatever it is, or either removing that or clearly defining it. And I saw propositions for both coming out of some of the major regulatory offices. And I think that they can go ahead and do that. We can carefully tune and craft this thing, but it cannot be a hatchet job. It cannot be, we're going to chop off 230. It cannot be, we're going to just hold everybody liable for something anyone else says. We don't actually do that in most places, but I similarly think that there is a part where these places do become publishers of statements based on their curation, and we need to consider how much that is. And I think the ultimate goal in that is reducing the amount of moderation that occurs and allowing for the open exchange of ideas, whatever that looks like.
Alison.
All I have to add is I just wish my peers in mainstream news would stop calling for censorship and be a little bit more long-sighted, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word, but not so short-sighted about this call for the locking down of disinformation and whatnot, and would be a little bit more wary of where that could lead us. I know that they may have jobs that are not going to be affected by it, and maybe their speech isn't going to be affected by it, but it could be down the road. And so that's all I have to say is I just wish journalists would just simmer down a little bit when it comes to calling for censorship.
I have noticed when it comes down to the law, when it comes down to the locking down of ideas and the locking down of humans, it seems to be those who are least affected that are the most supportive of it. The censorship of ideas it's a problem. What would 230 look like? I happen to think certain types of targeted harassment should not be allowed on platforms. Sure. That being said, in my chat, I bring up all the negative comments and all the positive comments, and I leave, I don't censor and I don't delete, because that only actually antagonizes more. And I genuinely think that when you can discuss, if you can discuss civilly, and even if you can not discuss civilly, that's where you see who's full of it, who can take it, who can actually reason their way through this world, and who is spewing nonsense that when challenged proves to be nonsense.
Well, perfect. And that's going to wrap up this discussion on this. I'm hoping somebody brought up, and I think it'd be cool if I can have some of you or a mix of you back, but to talk about cancel culture and self-censorship, which I am, all for, because I am constantly, I'm kind of self-censoring all the time. We're going, oh God, should I really talk about this subject right now? Or what should I do? And you guys, wow. So many brains in here, and I'm included, to hang out with you guys. I deeply, deeply appreciate that. And folks out there, if you like this and you like these amazing people, please subscribe so I get big enough to bring them back and be attractive to them. I need to get more grip
and get more super chat. Yeah.
Like this video right now and subscribe to Eric Hunley if you're first time. I tend to always forget to say that when on your show, Eric.
Well, no, thank you for saying that too. I'm the one who forgets to say it all the time myself. So everybody, thank you so much.
Have a good weekend, everyone.